Axios is ringing the alarm over Biden's so-called generous domestic policy proposals, essentially repeating lines from the US Chamber of Commerce while also simultaneously citing someone as deplorable as Larry Summers for these arguments. They write that some Democrats and economists have begun to worry that President Biden, intent on FDR-like transformation of a wounded America, is doing too much too fast. Some economists fear that all this spending will crank up inflation and put Biden's economic legacy at risk. Really, which ones? Like, which economists are we citing here? Who are we talking about? Because the only person cited by name in this very short article was Larry Summers. Larry Summers, who was Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton and started warning about inflation in February, told Axios he's more concerned than he was several months ago. If the spending is coming up front and the taxes are going down the road or coming down the road, he says, then on net, that's going to add fuel to the fire. Look, let's keep it real. Larry Summers does not like the idea of government spending on programs that actually help workers, especially when he knows that people like him will likely have to pay more in taxes. And Axios, I should note, didn't bother at all countering the narrative coming from the likes of Larry Summers. Just decided to print what he had to say and just let it stand without doing any type of investigation, any type of questioning into whether or not his narrative is accurate. One of the things, Cenk, that I'm sure you know about, we've talked about it on this show, is this notion that the unemployment benefits have just been too generous, and as a result, there's been a labor shortage. But if you actually look at the numbers and you understand why some workers have left the labor market, the story is very different from what these corporate interests would have you believe. So real quick, I'm just gonna share this data with you and then I wanna hear what you have to say. So Matt Bruenig over at the People's Policy Project found some interesting stats. Matt Bruenig also shares data that corporate Democrats despise, which is why they're so vicious against him and his wife, Elizabeth Bruenig. But here's what he found. We see that just under 6.5 million people newly found employment in March. In April, that number shot up to 6.9 million people who newly found employment. More job seekers are finding jobs than before, which is at odds with the idea that people who are out of work have become especially reluctant to come into the work or come into work due to unemployment benefits or similar. The increase in new employment has, however, completely overwhelmed by the number of people who went from employed to unemployed and people who went from employed to not in the labor force. These are people known as NILFs. And so the number of people moving into NILF status grew by an especially large amount. Importantly, NILFs are ineligible for unemployment benefits. And so this figure is at odds with the idea that unemployment benefits are a major driver of recent labor market dynamics. So who are the NILFs? Who are the people who are no longer, I know it's a funny word, but no longer in the labor force, you guys get it. Who are these people who have left the labor force? Turns out they're women, folks. I wonder why. So the number of women moving out of employment and into NILF status increased by a large amount from 1.8 million to over 2.5 million, while the same number actually decreased for men from 2 million to 1.8 million. Insofar as dropping out of work to take care of kids is more typical of women than men, these figures suggest that taking care of kids is the primary reason why NILF status increased last month and the primary reason why net employment growth declined last month.
Yeah, look, it's a long way of saying the numbers just don't bear that out at all. This nonstop talking point they have of Americans are lazy and they'd rather just sit at home and collect unemployment checks. The CEOs and the executives are wonderful, hardworking people, but the rest of you are all bums. Remember, they all originally were fired. They didn't choose to go on unemployment. They were fired because of this catastrophe in the pandemic. And by the way, Axios' reporting on this one is that it says there's loads of anecdotal evidence.
Well, you know how anecdotal evidence is really all you need to determine what the real issue is.
Yeah, and I'm curious what they mean by loads of anecdotal evidence. My guess is they at the cocktail party and the advertising meetings that they had, they're executive friends told them, oh my God, people aren't coming back to work. Really? Are your employees not coming back to work? No, but I hear. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence floating in the sky, especially when you have giant advertisers that are huge corporations. Okay, now, two pieces of unexpectedly interesting news, and then I want to get back to Larry Summers' nonsense. And Axios too. So some Democrats have apparently, this is at the bottom of what Axios is reporting, are now saying, well, if the economy is doing great and you're worried about inflation, et cetera, and now I'm putting some words in their mouth, I wish they said more of this, but the bottom line is they are saying, well, then you better raise taxes too, right? You don't want to overheat the economy, right? If you're gonna add spending, then at least increase taxes on those corporations. That'll both cool off the economy theoretically, right? And bring more money into the government to pay for those for that spending. It makes a lot of sense. So finally, there are some Democrats in Congress that apparently know what they're talking about and are actually making a sane economic point. They're at the bottom of the article, but hey. And here is a credit I would not have expected to give to Larry Summers. His last quote actually did make sense. We're fair, we actually look at the facts. What did they say? Does it make sense or doesn't it? At the end, he said, I think it's bizarre to be buying $40 billion a month of mortgage securities when the housing market is on fire. So that's actually a good point by Larry Summers. Why is the Fed pumping in all of that money into mortgage securities if you're worried about inflation, if you're worried about the housing market overheating, et cetera? And the reason is because the Fed is run by the banks. The New York Federal Reserve, which is the most important part of the Federal Reserve overall, is run by the giant banks in New York. So they print money and give it to themselves. Of course, the fact that that has never been talked about is insane. Now back to the main point. So Larry Summers and other so-called economists, because Axios says some economists, and then they write the giant headline, Biden's danger, the great overreaction, giving people, American people, too much money. Now notice they weren't worried about an overreaction when we were printing $4 trillion to give it to the largest corporations last year.
Of course not.
That is not when Larry Summers was concerned about overheating the market. When they were printing and giving trillions to the largest corporations in the world, nobody was in Washington was concerned. There were no economists that Axios could find that was concerned about printing all that money. They remember there's the Treasury money and then there's the money from the Federal Reserve. And to the tune of, there's about 2 trillion from Congress and about 4 trillion from the Fed. And at that point, 6 trillion, no, nobody's worried about it. Now, we did a stimulus plan of 1.9 trillion. And to be fair, the majority of that went actually to the American people. It was shocking, that almost never happens, and certainly wouldn't have happened under Trump and the Republicans. But okay, so that happened. Now all of a sudden, oh, it's overheated. Oh, that went to actually the plebeian, the masses? No, overheated. Oh, you're thinking of doing something that would affect the environment and get renewable energy and doing infrastructure, and all of it wouldn't go to corporations? Overheated. Yep. Stop it. Now, instead, what we're gonna do is we're gonna start squeezing you guys, lower spending, et cetera, and take it out of the hide of the American people. No, this is the oldest game in the book. The only reason why everybody in America doesn't already know it is because the media covers it up. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.